Good morning, and we're recording, and this is the first version of how it's called? Less Confusing Talks?
Yeah.
Less confusions in less? All right.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I'll start. Feature team adoption map. I will explain how I teach and also apply feature team adoption map. I think it's fairly in line with how also Bas and Craig look at it, but I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. So what I mean by that is basically exactly the intent of it and how it should be applied. Obviously, the visualizations and the way how to all kinds of variations of applying feature team adoption map could be also very different, and different people could doing it differently. Also, I will explain and give a very detailed example of how it looks like, how I do it. But I notice clearly that with each LeSS adoption, I do it slightly differently and different variations of it. I also talk about it when I do certain things not, and when I do certain things still. So first, I think it's important to kind of put it front, which is for you obvious, but still important to mention, is that feature team is a scale. So this is actually going to be quite important also in the feature team adoption map. So feature team adoption map, I see it much more than only a map. And that's also probably one of the problems on a website and in the books right now, because it gives an impression as if it is only that map, that visualization essentially. And the explanation is really simple, while in reality, I don't experience as simple at all. It's actually very comprehensive. There is lots of nuance and details to it. But the first one is what exactly is a feature team? Is basically a scale. It's not like a black-white thing. And so why feature team adoption map is really important as a practice is essential, actually, because there is this rule and a principle about. Oh yeah, okay. So I'm not going to observe the chats. I'm going to ignore them. So it's basically the how part of this principle in less huge, which is the way we make a distinction between the perfection towards which you are going, especially if you talk about a large organization and a less huge, and each step in towards that perfection, essentially. So this is what makes you less quite unique compared to other approaches. But then begs the question, how do you actually engage in this journey? And so especially when it comes to organizational improvement. And you have to have something, and that something is basically feature team adoption map. So what I'm saying basically, if you want to do less huge, if you're doing less huge, you have to have a feature team adoption map or something which is corresponding fully with that. So essential is essentially this practice. By the way, if you want to ask questions or interrupt or anything like that, be my guest. So feel free. So that's in a context of that. Now, the next part is what's important for understanding how feature team adoption map works, is that feature team doesn't work on all components. This is also often misunderstood, is that there is this assumption that if you have a feature team, it will work on all components. The reason for that is that as soon as you start to split up a big product backlog items, those product backlog items do not require change in all components. Hence, the feature team doesn't work on all works on those items, and they're going to work on items typically by discussion with each other, with different feature teams who can work best on which item. They're going to choose that, and they typically also choose based on what their capability is or what they can work on typically. And we specialize teams according to the customer domain, and because they are specialized according to customer domain, and they know a certain set of features, this obviously correlates with the components that are required to be changed in order to fulfill those features. So it's not like you have a bunch of features, and all those features require change in all components. So they're just simply not reality. This implies also that the feature team doesn't need to work on all components. Now, this will also be quite important in a feature team adoption map. Now, let me take an example of not working in all components. Imagine that you have some kind of an internal product in a banking product, but there is a one component which is outside and managed by a vendor. So one feature teams, in order to deliver something, occasionally or sometimes or often, require to change in a core banking component. Now, whenever that happens, if it's managed by a vendor, there is a clear component team structure, right? So because you have all the nasty dependency, and this leads to delays, etc., etc. So this we know. But then on the right side, what happened is with that core banking component is brought into the company. And so now it's not managed by a vendor, but actually managed internally in whatever way, rebuilt or just took over or whatever it is. Now it's actually, this component can be changed by a single feature team, let's imagine. So you have 3 feature teams, and only one feature team is actually capable of dealing with that component. And simply because it requires, I don't know, some specialized knowledge. But this group of teams, the 3, 4, 5, whatever teams is, and all together, we can still state that this group of teams is actually feature teams, including this component. Why? Is because whenever you have an item which requires a change in the specific component, you have the capability to execute upon that. It becomes only a problem if you have lots of items which require change in that component. In that case, you might say we still have a bit too specialized teams and limiting the agility, essentially. Alexei?
Yes, I have a short question. So in one of the previous slides, you showed the scale, right? You don't have to go to the previous slide. It's just
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm saying you said it's a scale, so it's not black and white. So I agree with that. And now you are making a distinction: component teams or feature teams. So do we need to make this distinction? And if yes, why would we have to do it? And if yes, where the boundary actually lies? Because what you're currently describing, I think it's where people really misunderstand LeSS. So I'm really grateful that you are showing that not all the teams need to work in all components, because that's what scares people away from LeSS. So we need to be clear in this messaging. But still, do we still need to separate between those black and white kind of definitions, or?
Yeah, so that's a more kind of like a how to use English in a clear way. By saying component team and feature team, we're making an implicit distinction, so which gives an impression of 2 different things, while in reality is basically a scale. And so sometimes I also say cross-component teams in order to emphasize this. And by introducing a third term, it gives a more idea of a scale. So
if a team works across 2 components, can you apply cross-component definition to it already?
Yeah, for example, the left version here, which you see, you could say these teams are cross-component teams, but they have a limitation when it comes to core banking. Yeah, and the right side, you could say they are more a feature team because they also incorporate a core banking. But you could also argue left side is also a feature team, but not as much as the right side. Yeah.
But don't we want them to be also customer focused and cross-component? But now Konstantin has a hand.
Yeah.
Kostya?
Yeah, that's your question is interesting. So what happens if only feature team 1 can work is cross-component but only on 2? And I would like to use Akov's or what is it? Cesario's terminology now. It's necessary but not sufficient, right, to deliver a feature. If the 2 components are enough and sufficient, then well, yes, of course, it's cross-component and it's a feature team.
Yes.
At the same time. But if there are 5 components required to deliver the feature, but they can only touch 2 components, well, they're cross-component, but they're not that far on the feature side yet. There is potential to grow towards a feature team. That's how I would phrase it.
All right. Thanks. Roland?
Yeah, I was wondering, on the right-hand side, you're drawing these feature teams. Are these feature teams in some sort of, some way related to each other, or are they independently working with their own product owner on their own feature? I was wondering if this is a group that works together on one backlog or not.
It works together on one backlog. Yes. So they're really you can imagine here a LeSS setup on the right side.
And the left side is not working from one backlog.
It could be also. They're also
Okay.
working from a single backlog and a single product owner, etc. But they're just simply not as much feature team as the right
So
side.
is this a precondition to be able to work with a feature team adoption map, that you're considering groups of teams working from one product backlog? Or not? Is there no relation?
No really relationship between.
No?
No. There is an implicit relationship, but it's kind of like I haven't thought about that actually. So it's a kind of an assumption through the whole thinking is that we are dealing with the less huge, so which implies always a single backlog and single product ownership.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So the whole context of discussion is. Yeah, R. Jones, what's your?
So
yeah.
Ricard here. Sorry,
Ricard,
I don't know how to rename myself in Google Meet.
I'll try to remember.
I think Craig used a different term, right? When I was at his CLP, so Craig used this term, extended feature team, and the reason that came up was because someone said, I have a lot of component layers in my organization, and Craig went, no, you don't. And he went, yes, I do. And he went, no, you don't. And then the guy goes, I work for a telecommunications company. And Craig went, yes, you do. Right? Because we're talking the mast on the building all the way, from concept to mast on the building. And then he drew this, the same thing on the right-hand side, but then he drew another set of layers, and he said sometimes your feature team can only go so far down the stack when you're in the early stages of adoption. So he called it extended feature team was the term he used, and I like that term better because I know that's not what you've got on the left, right? Because we've got a component team there, but the idea is to push in that direction still by calling that and trying to continue to extend that feature team's depth.
You mean extended component team, right?
I thought so also, but I'm not entirely
sure.
No, because we're going, so from the top, we've got orange, blue, and green boxes, yeah? So that would be like one feature team could go across all of that. And the reality is the red box is not one box. There's several like layers underneath that, and that would be another extended feature team. And his idea is one day you get the top to bottom somehow. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you see the difference now? And if you have that mentality, now we're not going to accept the component team forever. We're going to still strive for for feature teams. That's what we're going to strive for and move towards that constantly. I think was his, if I recall, it's quite a few years ago what he was trying to say.
Okay. Let's move on. So another thing is I noticed quite a lot of confusion is when we say a team can work on a component. So let's be clear. When we have a less or less huge, essentially what we say is that a feature team is a team that can work on any component within a group. Okay, so and people imply by saying that, this means that one team is working on all components, which is, as we just talked about, not the case. But it becomes interesting to kind of talk about what does it mean can in this case. So it means that the authority is provided. These are things that I observed. There could be some are missing here or etc. But this is kind of like what I observed in actual LeSS adoption. Authority provided, and when we say can, it can be very can be on a scale essentially. So can see the source code, but changes done by another team. Can suggest a change, but another team implements. Can submit a pull request, which is approved, etc., etc. And the last one is you actually fully, basically, shared ownership of the component. You can do everything. And but it could be levels in between, especially with some complex stuff. This is also a scale in a LeSS adoption. So when we say we want to expand the scope of what a feature team can do, this expansion is not only steps in between. Now I can grab this component. It could be steps in between to actually go to that direction. Okay, this might take also a long time depending on the complexity. Konstantin?
Yeah, so you're basically saying So the first column on the left, authority provided. You can summarize these things under the term private code policies, right? So basically what you are saying in here, weakening or strengthening private code policies. So the further up you are in this chain, and the stronger the private code policies, the further down on the list, the weaker they are until they're none. And it's shared code.
Yeah, correct.
And these things can also be defined per component, not only per team, right? So some components.
Yeah, it is actually per component indeed. Yeah.
So
Robert?
what I find when I work with a lot of banks is this, right? Is there's a misunderstanding because technology has moved on, and now with Git and everything else, everything's audited, up the wazoo. So everyone knows and can find out when this developer did that check or asked for this or asked for that with the code base. And once you impart that knowledge to people that everything is now audited, you can track everything, we can revert everything, then the restrictions start to become released because they haven't really thought about or realized that. And once you start making that clear, then a lot of these restrictions, if they're there, start disappearing because they realize they're not needed anymore.
Yeah, let me just for a sec continue on that, because exactly my next thing, what Rika just mentioned before going to Robert with a question. So exactly, this is what I meant also with the right side. In order to be able to work on other components, there has to be, typically requires a better test automation. And if you want more people to actually deal with the components, it requires technical excellence. So in the people themselves. So the people actually working on those components have to have a certain level of technical excellence. It has to be improved. And then a technical stack itself, code quality, architectural mess typically made, knowledge of specific tech stack. So for example, in that one component managed by vendor, imagine that you take into house, but it's some kind of a very different tech stack. So not Java, but something very, very different. So people need to learn about that. And maybe sometimes you want to reduce number of different technologies and programming languages that are used. So what's important is actually not only when we say a team can work on a component, is not only a matter of how good that component is, but is also the actual capability of the team. So that will also be an important piece of information when we talk about the feature team adoption map. Yeah. Robert?
So I mean, what you're saying here is that basically you already moved to the scale of closer to the feature team by recognizing what you say here on the authority provided, that just by knowing, like viewing the source and giving some options on how to change that, you become already closer to a feature, even though it's not the perfect feature team that we would like to see in LeSS, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Also, you could also say, I think that's what Joshua also mean is that the more you work on the right side, the easier it becomes to provide authority. But I also seen situation quite often that is just a matter of providing authority, meaning that you have a senior developers who are perfectly capable to start working on a completely new code base, but for whatever reason, political or whatever it is, they are not allowed. So that's also sometimes part of the change. So now, before you get on with the feature team adoption map, one thing is also the product definition, which obviously before you need to establish the product itself. But then what's interesting is that there is also something called expanding product definition, which is also a journey. So then it begs the question, what is exactly the difference between expanding product definition and a feature team adoption map? Well, it serves the kind of a same purpose, because in the beginning of a LeSS adoption, product definition could be limited, and then later on you expand it. Typically, how expansion could be triggered is by actually following feature team adoption map, and then you discover that your product definition is too limited. You have a certain dependencies that you really want to get as part of the product, but it's actually considered outside of the product. So there is, in a way, overlap between feature team adoption map and product definition expansion. So is also in the beginning, when I just became LeSS trainer, I was a bit confused by the product definition, because I thought first that product definition needs to be immediately in the beginning perfect. But that's just simply not possible and not the idea for the LeSS huge. It becomes impractical. And so sometimes you have a somewhat suboptimal product definition simply because it's too hard, like a department boundaries. And you don't want to start immediately destroying department boundaries just because you have your ideal product definition. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. So let me take an example to dive in how it actually works. And this example is as realistic as possible, but it's still a hypothetical example. So let's imagine now a product, which is a health insurance. Okay, so a health insurance company. And one of the first steps in a feature team adoption map that I do is ask the group to draw this architectural diagram. It doesn't need to be comprehensive, but it has to be. It has to have a certain quality to it, meaning that the components on the lowest level are stuff which is clearly managed by a specific group of people or specific individuals. That's pretty clear. So there's a correlation between a group of people working on something and a lowest level component. So you don't need to go at the lower level than that. And it will become later obvious why this matters. Second aspect is that you recognize grouping here as levels of granularity. So you can see the actual components, which are policy provider, quoting engine, loading, rules and regulations, etc. So these are the components then. And then you have call it a system in this case. So system meaning like insurance sales system. And that system contains multiple components. And then there is a third level, which is basically, in this case, onboarding. Just I forgot to put the name to it. So the customer onboarding. Everything related to customer onboarding is basically a combination of insurance sales, insurance underwriting, finalize a payment. So that's basically done customer onboarding. And a separate one is system, or a separate one, let's call it subproduct, is basically everything related to claims. Okay, so there is this granularity, and so you could say at the highest level of granularity there is a subproduct. Subproduct customer onboarding and subproduct claims. Okay. And so this granularity is important. Now, this is an example of granularity. Every company has a different terminology and different granularities. What's important in feature team adoption map is to avoid having too many granularities. So there is a correlation between number of people involved and a number of granularities that you want to have. And so if you have something like, I don't know, 150 people involved, 100 people involved, then more than 3 is too much, okay? And if you talk about more than 150 people, there could be a 4 of granularity that's useful, etc. So this is then done together with a bunch of people, typically management, and with representatives from the teams, so senior developers, vocal developers, and a few other roles, and they talk about this. Now, what's the next step in the workshop? Now, the next step is that I ask them, can you please write down the number of people involved with each of the components? And so they write it down. And now you recognize why it's important to not to go too deep level of granularity. It becomes too confusing and too much information. So this, in this case, there is a bunch of people involved in all kinds of components. Okay. Now the next question.
Assuming here that people are single component.
Yes.
Okay, that's important to say, because otherwise the numbers don't make sense, right? The way you want them.
Yeah. So this is
that realistic? Is it realistic to not have, is really everybody single component? In reality, it might be a mix of things. So how do you manage the mix of things? If certain teams or people work on multiple components, how do you reflect this?
You reflect it in the picture itself. So in this picture, you can imagine, for example, insurance booking system is a very large system. It involves 20 people, and they're actually multiple teams, but they are actually cross-component teams, somewhat cross-component. So that can
Cross
be
component within within the insurance booking system, right? Because the insurance booking system is itself multiple components.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what, can you tell me again what the rule of thumb is? How you determine this number of granularity? Because this is where I got stuck multiple times, because they come up with all these other components they do. How do you aggregate that to a sensible level? Is that just gut feel, or how do you do it?
I explain. Essentially, I tell them draw the components which correspond to the boundaries of the teams they're working on, or of groups of teams which are working on. So I want to have on a lowest level stuff which is clearly owned by a dedicated group of teams, no matter how large that group of teams is. Yeah, and what happens after that typically is they still get a bit confused what it means, but then it's easy to rectify. I go to them and I see what they draw and say, you know what, remove this and just put one. Don't go to so much detail. It's not necessary.
One of the things that I found useful just for Roland is the Simon Brown has a good C4 model, and he talks about system context, which is the product, and then container, and within container you have components. So sometimes introducing container concept is very good, because then that's the boundary context that you're talking, and one context can contain many container components. And I think a lot of time teams are organized around those container than the component itself within that container.
Yep. Yeah, that sounds good. There's the only thing is that the only thing is that different companies use different terminology.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I can avoid another set of new terminology in the company, then rather not. But it is a bit of a challenge always, because sometimes companies are not aware of they're using this terminology, and so then we need to kind of uncover that. So how do you call this group of components? Yeah, how do you call that? And so then they think they don't have a name for it, but they actually do often. So now after that, and this step seems trivial, but it's anything but trivial, is they need to decide with which group to start. Oh yeah, C4 model, yeah, exactly. So with which group to start? So there are all kinds of reasons, could be political, whatever, why they want to actually start with this group. So it's mainly management which decides, and they want to start with. And what I mean is start is basically decide that they're going to train those people in a CLP, and then after that, the group itself needs to decide whether they want to actually do it or not. And so in any case, the question here is to them always, please circle around components and people, which should be about 50 of them. And with those people, we're going to then start working on. Now, as you notice in this case, they excluded this one. I'll come to that. So I use that as an example. That's a typical example that happens. They explicitly exclude. And to make it short, why they exclude at this point is simply because it's really hard to include this component and these people into the feature teams. It's just a too hard step. And so now we have about 50 people. And then after that, you have a flip, obviously. And changing the feature teams. Those feature teams clearly going to be immediately having a expanded capability, simply because component people are spread across multiple teams, etc. So this is already Roland.
Yeah. So you're asking the people to see how they think they should group the components, how they belong together. Did I get that right? To draw the line around these boxes.
Yeah, the line is basically with which group are going to start, because these are component teams. And now if we start with that group, the idea is to eventually restructure them into feature teams.
Based on what do you draw that line? Like the strongest dependencies, or?
So there is several factors. One factor is you want to be customer centric. So you generally don't want to start with some kind of a backend system. Second one is you look kind of for low-hanging fruits, meaning that you want to combine systems where you can actually work end-to-end and really deliver value, customer value, without having over-dependence on something too much dependence on something in the backend. And then there could be several other factors, just willingness of the people to engage in a change, typically managers involved. And there could be also tech stack. For example, is this something more modern technology or something archaic? Yeah, these kind of factors.
How much change is practical, basically?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so then so this is already. I'll get back to the a bit more about the flip and how it affects the feature team adoption map. But one thing to kind of now keep in mind is once you flip into the feature teams, it's you're basically having a certain capability and which is expanded, and it's essentially capability not per team but per group, for the whole group of teams. This is why actually we're not talking about here feature team adoption map for the purpose of improving teams, but improving the organization. So it's organizational view, not per team view. I'll get back to that to explain a bit more what it means.
Say that again, Victor, please.
So feature team adoption map is not a map of teams. It's a map of organizational improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this means that it doesn't make much sense to say per team how capable each team is. So for example, you cannot go to each team and say, how many components can you do? That doesn't make sense. That's not useful information. Because the purpose of a feature team is not to do as many components as possible. The purpose of a feature team is to deliver customer value end to end. And that depends all the time and differs all the time. That's why I wanted to mention before that the feature team doesn't mean that you can do all components. And since you don't need to do all components, then it's not useful to measure that, how many components you can cover. Greg?
Hi, Victor. It's nice of you to be here giving us this talk. I just wanted to know what your impression was, and if you've done the same thing that I've done, to get a sense of how much cross-component development is really needed if you look at a longer-term backlog or roadmap, let's say speculative development for the next year and a half or two, with columns of the major components and which features impact which components. It sort of gives you a demand-based forecast. I've had some people react thinking they really didn't like that visualization, and other people who really did like that. And I was just curious if you used that as a way to kind of set an ideal state of what sort of, not all teams need to do all things, but there may be bottlenecks in certain components and so on.
Yeah, that's actually really important, and especially important in forming the requirements areas. And because it's it really actually sets the stage by knowing what is expected for the coming time. It sets the stage essentially for what do we mean by if we say we have feature teams, because the purpose of a feature team again is not to be cross-component but to actually deliver customer value. But we have to know what that expected customer value is. What are we going to work on in the coming time? So let me take a unrealistic but extreme example to make the point. Imagine that you're a company working on a certain components, and for whatever reason, company decides, you know what, all the components that we're working on, we need to ditch it and build new ones. Then this points to the importance of focusing on what exactly they want to achieve, because then it becomes pointless to look at existing components maybe, but you need to then think very differently. That's obviously not a very realistic example, but that's just to emphasize the point of how to position ability to take care of components. Now, next one is, as I mentioned before, that complicated subsystem. Okay, I think you know why I'm using this terminology, so I give it that name, complicated subsystem. And so in this case, it's some kind of a system with a very low quality C# code and no testing, etc., etc. And this is the reason why it's not incorporated in the rest, not yet, because it's too difficult. Okay. So this becomes this is also part of the change in journey. So in the beginning, the first step, you don't include that, but then you do want to actually dive into the detail of that component and see what do we exactly have here, and what's the level, what's the state of this component, and also this group of people working on it. you want to assess that. You want to know that. So complicated subsystem is in this case an example, but it basically applies to all components. Okay. So this means that sometimes, Alexei?
I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow this morning, still reacting to the previous discussion you had with Greg. So are you saying you will actually look in the backlog for the next year and try to understand which components are required to do the work? Okay,
Yes.
and based on that, you would do this basically. You would form this first group of teams, right? Working on that, like this circle around 4 components would be formed based on that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it's just that the example that I'm providing here makes assumption that the required work for the coming time fairly correlates with how things are organized. Meaning you have a claims, you have an onboarding customer. That's not going to change anytime soon in a significant way. It's going to be more or less the same. But there could be situations where it's a huge deviation from the structure, and then you really need to. The number one priority is to really organize teams around customer value, not around the components.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but then if yes, if you would use that approach that Greg has just mentioned, that I think it would be nice. Like if the deck that you are using for teaching, I think you should also show some kind of backlog and features and this analysis that you do before you draw this red line, because it was random kind of.
Yeah. So this part is part of the training. So, but there is obviously explaining the requirements areas and product backlog and all that stuff. Indeed, it's just that in this part we are talking about organizational improvement and how to move to that direction. Then, yeah. So it's kind of like from opposite side moving. Yeah. Pascal?
Yes. Do you also check, let's say, in the current? If you're looking at the current demand, let's say on the components, different size, different skills needed. So for the next feature team that they are capable of doing so, you look forward to, and you say, hey, this demand is now we're looking forward. And do you also check on what demand was, let's say, from backwards? As hey, as you can see, this components will now be, let's say, more needed skills. So we need so back and forward. So we also can see there the change from current situation to the predicted assumption future situation.
Yes, in fact, actually, in this picture, if the lines that I draw here in between components are the lines of based on a previous experience and also expectation, similar expectation in the future. There is a dependence on changes. So if I need to change rules and regulations, I will probably also need to often change complicated subsystems.
Yeah, I did it once, and I said, checking, let's say, reality that should now also see that it reflects that it's changed now with the previous demands, let's say.
Yes. Yeah.
Check.
So sometimes it's actually useful, and it didn't happen often. Only once actually I did this, something like this, is to assess basically components, and so to create this kind of assessment and say per component we have a we have a kind of a scale, implicit scale here, and with the coloring. So green means it's pretty good. So this component can be easily shared by anybody, and the people have a knowledge about it, and the component itself is good, etc. So you can then fill out here all kinds of information about why is it good. And then I took complicated subsystem as another example. So authority. Yeah, there is some level of authority that can be provided to others for whatever reason, and then and details can be then put here in the box, and then the rest is all red because testing automation is completely missing, technical excellence is also missing, quality is pretty crap, and the tech stack is also bad. So so this is then you can do it for all components, and then this also becomes a kind of a journey of improvement. Konstantin?
What do you mean here by technical excellence in a component? I mean, people have technical excellence, right? But what has it to do with component?
So you're right. So this doesn't represent only component readiness, so capability and component readiness. So I kind of combine the both. Yeah. So ability of the people to apply the technical excellence. Yeah, because it's usually kind of intertwined. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
And then these components that you're listing here might be groups of physical components because they were too granular. So this is like a
yes.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Karel?
How do you assess the technical excellence skills? It might be quite sensitive.
Yeah. So yeah, it depends per situation. So I don't have some kind of standard way of assessing it. So it's more going through the different areas, like how much do people know solid principles, or just simply maintaining a properly proper code, readability of the code, and then test-driven development. Do they even write do they know how to write unit tests? And if they do know, do they know how to actually do this properly? And refactoring skills, etc. So it's also per situation. In some situations, some aspects are more important than others. Yeah. I don't have a standard thing.
Did you experience some kind of resistance, or maybe people trying to deceive you or feel bad about it?
Oh, no, because this is actually done by the teams themselves. And it's part of, I'm just assisting them. They actually decide and they assess that. Because the level of discussion with the teams is basically, do we agree that you want to be more cross-component? Yes. Okay. So what's blocking you to do that? Well, the code is shitty. I don't know how to deal with that. Okay. Maybe you should learn how to deal with the shitty code. And that's a capability of the team.
So you're not the judge of that. Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. Now, the feature team adoption map. Now, this is also standard what's basically in the LeSS material. There is a y-axis, x-axis, and so typically the y-axis is a kind of a different scope, is kind of expanding. I will talk about it in detail, don't worry. And then x-axis is basically you start with using definition of done and a potential shippable to start, essentially. But keep in mind that an x-axis on a feature team adoption map is not the same as definition of done. I'll show you why not. So it's a quite different thing. It's just that you use definition of done as a source of information to create the x-axis. So let's dive in. Now, this is this one you clearly know. Okay, so you can see already in a default example, it's a more than only definition of done stuff. So designing stuff, etc. And so which is typically not part of definition of done. And yeah, and so it shows basically the level of cross functionality. So it's not the capability of the team, by the way. It shows the level of cross functionality. And I make a distinction between capability and cross functionality in this case. Why? Is because imagine that you have a team and somebody says, you know what, our teams are not so capable, okay? And so the stuff is not done properly, etc. You know what? If we just add architect to it, then everything will be better. No, I mean, that's a good thing. Remove the label and put the person there, but it doesn't make it automatically better. It does help make that better, but it doesn't make team better. So so there's a difference between capability and cross functionality, and this is cross functionality. It's not the capability of the team. Okay, it's an organizational improvement. So you're changing organization, so you're creating conditions for teams to improve. Okay. Now, and this is actually more the capability. Okay, y-axis is actually more capability. And the reason why, I actually just talked about it. Capability. Okay. So it's capability of the teams to work on more components. So, yeah.
I didn't understand why horizontal is also not capabilities. I know you're trying to make this point very clear. Could you make it clearer, please?
Okay, so essentially this axis shows the organizational change.
You mean horizontal?
Horizontal axis. Sorry, I thought you see my.
We see kind of, but it's jumping
Okay.
a little bit.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So x-axis is organizational change, an organizational change in making teams more cross-functional. So it basically just. Yeah.
But the vertical is also, because you're forming feature teams, you're doing a flip. That's also organizational. But to learn to do tests is also capabilities. So why do you actually need to separate between organizational and capabilities? Well, what is the point you're trying to make here?
Okay, let me go back to this one. Imagine that you have now feature teams after flip, okay? And now you say, how do we make sure that these feature teams also work on a component, complicated subsystem? You do not change the organization. You simply improve the capability of the teams to work on a complicated subsystem. And you improve the component itself. You don't want to be fiddling with the team structure all the time. Once you set up the teams, you don't want to start changing the structure and putting more people into it.
But if you add those capabilities of that complicated subsystem to the teams in the red circle or red form, then there will be some kind of change, because the complicated subsystem people will lose their work or will transfer their work, and then, or how do you see this? This is just.
That could be the case, but equally it could be simply that the complicated subsystem team people themselves expand their capability and they become a feature team, not necessarily through restructuring. I mean, it could be.
I agree to that, but why can we say it's both? It's organizational and team capabilities. Then I can agree, but you're trying to kind of distinguish between them, and I don't see your argument to be really strong here, actually.
Okay, let me give you I'm going to jump a bit to this one, and I'll come back later on. Imagine that you have now a second flip in the same organization. It's less huge, remember? So it's a first less group and then another less group. Now we have two groups, and those two groups they are cross-functional. They deliver features, etc. But they're actually full-fledged feature teams. Well, actually, not really. Now we are missing knowledge of loading. We have a dependency on loading. Does it mean that these so-called feature teams, every time when there's something with loading needs to happen by the other group there? No. This group needs to just simply learn about loading. You don't want to fiddle with teams. In less huge, way more common way of expanding feature teamness or a scope of capability is by acquiring knowledge than restructuring. Only in the beginning you have a restructuring and adding people to the teams, but later on this is rather exceptional.
Based on your experience with less huge, Victor, right?
Yes.
It's not a rule or an axiom. That's, I mean, to be really clear what you're trying to say. That's how you saw less huge being done. Right?
No, there is also a rule. A rule says do not restructure teams. Do not change team structures. Teams are stable. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
But once you've done it, you mean? Once you've done it, don't keep redoing it.
Yes.
Yes. So essentially the movement known as dynamic reteaming is avoid that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a separate topic. There is an exception to it, but let's keep it for now outside, so it's not related to feature team adoption map. But in any case, yeah. Who said Victor? Oh.
This group works on loading. Does that mean a move on the vertical axis or on the horizontal in your feature team adoption map?
So the expansion of the capability of a finalize and payment system group towards making sure they also can change loading is expansion on the y-axis. And I can show that example. Let me continue a bit, and then you can come back to that. Maybe it's going to clarify with the next things that I'm going to show. So this one you already know, so I'm not going to talk about it, I think. So let me give another example, and actually building up on an actual health insurance product here. Okay, so now I'm creating a feature team adoption map. So in this case, And this is another, I think, misunderstanding, and which is due to two simple example on a website, is that the X and Y axis are very, very simple, straightforward. There is not much actually happening on the axis, but that's actually anything but true. It's really hard to actually create an X axis and Y axis. And the reason why is because whoever is involved in discussion, especially management, really have to know what the heck is going on in the teams, how the product is actually being built. So which aspects are here important? Okay, so the people really need to go to Gemba and know that. So it might actually take us several times to create this axis, because they have to understand much better what's going on. In some companies, management just doesn't have that knowledge. Yeah. Karel?
And is it different every time, or have you seen any patterns in how the x-axis looks like?
Yeah, it's
in the
different.
end.
It's different every time, especially if you have a very different types of products. Yeah. So, for example, the website shows the telecom, which is a really bad example. How many of you are working on telecom? Not many. Yeah. Oh, okay, Christoph, good.
What's the order? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would actually use some other examples, or at least more examples than only telecom.
What's the order of things on the x-axis? How do you order things?
Okay, so let me dive into that. X-axis. Okay, so the order is basically of cross-functionality. How difficult it is to actually get teams to be more cross-functional. So typically in the beginning, when you when you existing teams typically already can do unit testing, coding, maybe contract testing when it comes to services, but then when you do a flip, then they automatically can also do requirements gathering, end-to-end testing maybe, and so order of difficulty of getting them in. And so it's a basically organizational change, and yeah, getting that into the team.
And the ones which are outside of the yellow box, how do you rank those things? I mean, what's the order of things? Why UI design goes before BA refinement, and BA refinement goes before security and stuff?
It's contextual. So I kind of imagine in this case that for whatever reason, this is UI design is easier to incorporate into the team than other things.
Okay, so that's easiness of or hardness of incorporating that.
Yeah,
that's the order.
Yes.
Okay.
Greg?
I have the feeling that there may be a slight difference in how we teach, probably in how we teach and how we do it. But to just comment briefly to Alexi's question, I ask each team to write on Post-it notes everything needed in order to deliver an item. So they're, in a sense, everything that would be in the definition of done as well as the undone work. And I have them order it from left to right based on what they already can do. And they're strongly competent in on the left, and what they're starting to learn or would like to learn towards the right. And that's sort of the logical sequence. I wouldn't impose some sort of, supposed waterfall process or some sort of hierarchy of the tasks or something along the skills, but just let the teams express it as they will. And if you have several teams doing this at the same time in a big room, they may come up with somewhat different interpretations. And I think that's actually kind of helpful to see if someone's forgotten something, or you can do a merge after you've done a diverge.
Thank you.
Anyway,
so are you saying, Greg and Victor, these horizontal axes, labels on the axis, these are basically the steps in your definition of done, from the one that is already there to the ones which you'll be having after the flip to the ones which are not yet in the DoD?
So actually, I don't hear anything different from what Greg explains. I think just the formulation seems only different. And is this definition of done? No. For a simple fact, you don't have to do UI design in order to get stuff done.
What do you mean?
That's the UI design is a precondition. You don't have to do requirements gathering in order to get something done. Requirements gathering is never part of definition of done.
It's a list of skills, basically. You could think of it that way.
Yes. Yes.
Why requirement gathering is not definition of done?
Because you can deliver stuff and it can be completely done and the user happy without doing requirements gathering. I make up as a developer a story, just to mention an example. So it's an activity. You could have architecture, designing, requirements gathering, and so on and so on. These are all stuff which is not part of definition of done, but it's an important activity. It's important part of development. Definition of done is the stuff that is really black-white that has to be checked off that in order to consider something done.
You could refactor a part of the code base, and this improves speed for the customer user without having any requirement to do that. You just did that, and it's an inadvertent benefit to the customer. You didn't need a requirement for that.
Yeah.
So if we look a bit maybe from a different perspective for this, if we have a look at companies where Taylorism is deeply ingrained, then you would usually find those departments or groups in the org chart that say programming, that say unit testing, that say contract testing. Another group would be requirements gathering, and so on. So if you go to that extreme, or this kind of companies, you would just list the amount, all the functional single function groups on the x-axis. Which are,
and don't you want eventually these functions to be incorporated in the teams in a DoD? Then?
Alex, can you say again? I didn't hear the first part.
And then essentially you would want these functions to be incorporated in the team being cross-functional.
You would want the tasks they do to be in the DoD, but not the functions, right?
Well, the functions to the tasks.
I mean, requirement gathering probably not, but let's say in case of automotive industry and you want to release a piece of software, well, after coding and even unit testing, you need to do specific stuff due to regulation in order to get it shipped. So this definitely goes to the definition of done. But requirements gathering, no one cares about it. You code it already.
Yes.
So you don't start coding without requirements gathering. So it's I would if you want to put requirements gathering somewhere, then I would put it maybe like in definition of ready if it exists. If it doesn't, then just remove it.
Steve, I think.
No, I think I was first.
Oh, sorry, Ronald.
Yeah. To continue on what Craig said and a little bit on what Konstantin just said. When you let the people make sticky notes with the skills they need to be able to deliver work, then depending on how they look at their work, you might end up with things they see as skills that might actually be have to be on the vertical axis. Or does that never happen? Is it always very clear? I mean, security could be a skill.
Yeah. Yeah. So to yes. So I don't when I practice this, I don't go so far in making it so black-white. It's not like x-axis is not a capability or not a skill or something like that. So it's yes, there is a certain aspects to it which are actually more skills, especially if you have formed the teams. And you don't want to start fiddling with the teams when you expand the x-axis. So what do? You improve the capability of existing people. So that's, you could say, that's actually that's clearly a skill. Yes, it's just on a grand scale of what axes represent. It's a predominantly cross-functionality. It's the organizational change. So, for example, if you say security. Architecture. I don't know if you put I didn't put architecture. Let's say architecture. Okay, so the technical architecture. Imagine that. So now, how do we actually make teams more capable? That part of cross functionality add to the team. Well, kill the architecture team. That's how you make it. Usually, that's enough. And,
yeah. Okay, but and regulatory. I mean, that means that you need to you add certain stuff into some system or log some things that you do or verify. So that's not really a skill, is it?
A similar story. So it's a regulatory requirement. Depends on what we're talking about. Because most companies' regulatory requirement, what I observe is there is a people in between who got knowledge about regulatory requirement because they are the ones interacting with regulator. But as soon as you actually take them out, then this kind of automatically flows into the team, and then team gets a lots of knowledge of it. Yeah. Steve?
Hey, so last year I spent a lot of time in a financial institution, and they had an idea that sort of overlaps with this, but in a very bad way. They had the idea of all the different activities that they think need doing to make a feature, to make something work, and then they would have traceability to ensure that all these activities had taken place, right? And they thought that was what definition of done should be about and all that kind of thing. So they confused these two things because it wasn't about whether, you could view it as like a checklist to say, well, have we looked to see whether UI design is important or not for this? But that they were seeing it more as, well, in our Tayloristic way of doing it, we would always have the UI design people have to be handed the work to do. Therefore, when we work in a more cross-functional way, we're going to have to make sure that UI design has been done as a distinct kind of slot of time and Jira ticket and all the rest of it. So I think there's often this confusion between activities that take place and definition of done. Definition of done is not usefully a list of all the activities that should have taken place, I don't think. I think it's more looking at the outcome or the output or here is what's changed in developing this feature, and what are the characteristics of this? Does this cover all the different characteristics? Is it maintainable? It's almost like properties of the system being maintained rather than activities that have been completed. And of course, there's a relationship between these. You know, if something is still well documented, you'd presume you might have to change the documentation to do that. But really what we care about is the system continues to be well documented, not so much documentation was done. But there's an understanding that these things kind of mean the same thing often in teams. You know, it's often hard to get people to always write things in terms of outcome conditions rather than activities. But when you get to this kind of thing here, it's becoming clear to me, this is a new piece of information for me, I think, that it's not so useful to think about this as strictly what I mean by definition of done on the x-axis, but it's more like saying, look, here are the activities that happen, which activities can happen within a team. So there's a kind of subtle distinction there, I think.
Yes. Yes, and just to add to that, is again, it's organizational change that some of the activities, as you mentioned, they are seen too much from a traditional way of things, like it has to be done and it has to be done in blah, blah, blah. So, then it could be actually not a matter of gaining some kind of a skill, because it's exaggerated skill. It's about organizational change, getting rid of stuff that we assume it's necessary, even departments that belong to it or whatever it is. Okay, let me go back to here. So y-axis and what's there now. Keep in mind this picture that I showed you before. So we have these different levels of granularity, remember? So there's a component, there's a system, and there is a then call it a sub-product, okay? And then there is a whole product in this case. So this is terminology in this case to kind of understand. And so that's what we actually see here also. No, this one. So what we see here also, component, system, sub-product, product, and then a problem. Now, problem is a perfection. It means that feature teams go to customer and they just solve the problem. Who gives a shit about which product or whatever? Okay, components, they don't matter anymore. Okay, so that's a kind of a perfection. And a component, the way you draw it is by putting in between the brackets. Sorry, it's a bit small, but it's basically the names of the components, okay, that you saw in the picture. That's why architectural diagram is important. And so that is a clear representation when we say component, that everybody understands what it actually means. And okay, same with the subsystem, same so in subproduct and the product itself. Okay. Now, before a flip, the situation was like this. Okay, so component teams which are able to do certain things, and then after a flip, it goes up to this level. And this aspect is not in a documentation of LeSS, which means that this axis is way more than it seems. So there is not only these levels, but it could be levels in between. Okay,
it's
so
way
in this
what?
case, it's way more detailed. So way more detail. You can put the levels in between. So in this case, I draw this yellow box basically on accept a complicated subsystem. So it's a bit lower than a system. Understand? And so and then you can also so that's a then visualization. And later on, I ask them to continue. So we talk about okay, so how does it gonna look? How do we expand further? Okay, so how to expand further? You say, well, the next thing is that we need to actually learn TDD. So if we learn all test-driven development, we will be able better to deal with the more components.
Why TDD is not a horizontal thing?
Sorry?
I think Roland will have the same question. Why TDD is not a label on a horizontal axis? Here, where the map I find really confusing, because now you're mixing skills and
It's the third dimension.
It's the third dimension, or it's X dimension, or I'm just confused because I'm sick.
Yeah.
Or do you mean maybe you mean TDD should be the move we do on the horizontal axis, and the consequence is that we can do more on the vertical axis?
Well, TDD is not on the x-axis, because you would not have a single function group in your org chart saying just this group does TDD, everyone else does coding and testing afterwards, right? It's a skill. That's why the third dimension.
I don't know.
It's how you do the coding.
How you do the coding. Some of the we had this conversation in our candidate list a year ago or 2 years ago. I started it, and one of the trainers, I can't remember which one, he or someone from Australia, I believe. Yeah, he answered that he always thinks about a third dimension there.
Yeah,
and that opened my eyes.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And there is and it probably would be better to actually create a third dimension for a better visualization and for a better understanding what we're talking about here. And but it can be done. This is how it can be done essentially on this scale, because the reason why, just to react over remarks of a skill and blah blah blah, is again what I mentioned before. What matters is we are on y-axis again measuring the capability and component readiness. So the capability is the number one. That's what you measure, because if you have the capability as teams, you will be able to deal with more components. Understand? So if you have that, simply by expanding your capability, doing test-driven development will enable you to deal with more components. Without that, you cannot deal with more components. Understand? So this is important to kind of like why it's actually on the y-axis. Having said that, I still agree it's probably better to actually create another dimension. Yeah. Also, having said all of that, it's a visualization thing. What matters is that the idea behind is understood, and then you can have your own ways or better ways to visualize that. Okay.
But this is where feature team adoption map is really confusing tool, because you're putting everything on the axis, and then becomes really hard. I mean, we can agree here and understand, but if it's a tool which is on the website in a book, that actually Craig Lerman doesn't even mention in his class. I mean, if that's the tool we expect LeSS practitioners to master, yeah, if yes, then it should be also understood for a broader audience. Otherwise,
so let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
What do you consider feature team adoption map? Do you mean this map?
I think it's a question with a Tariq in it. I think,
yeah, because for me it's not
all the tools, all the thinking behind the map. Yeah. I think you want to hear the answer, but yes, this map.
Yeah. So, but for me it's not. Yeah, for me, it's not actually. This map is just a visualization. The feature team adoption map is everything what I just explained in the past 1.5 hours. So it's basically a practice of getting into journey from start and to the perfection.
Okay, so then let's call it a feature team adoption practice that has one visualization called a map. Maybe change the name. The naming maybe just causes confusion, because I also thought we were talking about this map that has been presented.
I will update it immediately on the LeSS.
It should be mapping, and then maybe it's a continuous activity or something. Anyway, and nobody is gonna rename anything on a LeSS website. We know that for sure. So let's keep the discussion. So yeah, the map is everything you've just explained. All right, but still.
Christoph, you want to say something? I cannot hear you. Oh. So you need to move your mouse and click.
Steve was first.
I cannot hear you, Christoph.
You can't. What the hell?
Now we do.
Can.
Now
You
we
can. Okay, so one comment from my side was that actually this is not a model. So it's more like like a user story, like endless discussion. Is a practice for having, like a promise for having a conversation. So I see feature teams adoption map as something for having a conversation. So it's always very different, and you start from different angles, from broad or for narrow product. And you put some elements of the architecture, subsystems, systems, you combine it into domains and so on, and then you want to have a picture of what is possible to start with, where we are now, what would be the first step toward more customer-centric, but then it's kind of like dynamic, so it's not a model.
Yes. Steve?
Hey, so So what I'm hearing, which I think is really cool, is that this is a useful map for an activity with teams to help them understand their journey forward. Right? So it's very contextual in that sense. Like it's a one-off. It doesn't make sense to have the golden version of this that is the one. This is created by teams. It's very contextual to where they are on their journey and where they're going, and it's supposed to be useful to them in plotting the course forward. So there's no universal sort of perfect knowledge here or whatever. It's just what's useful to help the team be guided.
Yeah.
Now I see the bottom axis here, just talking about the x-axis. The x-axis is full of things, right? It's full of positive things, that activities that could be done, or if we include the test-driven development sort of thing, is how you do the activities or whatever. There's actually positive things there, and we're saying if you add more things that are good things in, and perhaps with architecture, there's sort of taking something out of the organization might be there a little bit, but generally it's adding things in. The other way of looking at this is through what gaps there are in the system. So if you look from like, left to right on the x-axis, with adding things in view, you start with a small number of things, and then you're adding more and more things that a team can do. If you take a gaps view, then, well, it's kind of similar, but on the right, you're saying there are no gaps. Like extreme right, there are no gaps in what a team could do. They have every skill they could possibly have. And on the other side, of course, it's mostly gaps, right? There's just one thing they can do, and everything else is just a big gap for everyone. Of course, the specific things are different for all your different departmental teams, but there's just gaps everywhere. And as you move, the gaps kind of, the gaps kind of get smaller. If you look at it in terms of gaps, and you're not worried about what the gaps are, but the fact of the gaps existing, it's like a granularity thing. Like, are there big grains or small grains? We're moving from small grains to big grains. Right? So you're moving from sand to rocks in terms of granularity.
Yeah.
And I think that's more of a universal kind of model. It's less useful. Right, it's a lot less useful for the specific case because it's not guiding the context like this is, but it's also telling a story that's more universal of saying, your organization at the moment in terms of skills is like sand everywhere. Everyone's got a grain of sand that they're holding onto very tightly.
Yeah.
What you want to do is to clump this sand together and make these sandcastles or rocks or whatever, and you end up with these rocks that people have got in terms of their skills.
Yeah.
I think this whole conversation today was sort of triggered by understanding the map better, and Victor's kind offer to spend some time doing that. Fantastic. And also Alexi and Roland looking at org topologies and saying, well, how does this different? How is it similar to this? So the reason I explain this, I think at least on the x-axis, this can be explained by the granularity, meaning how fat are the greens. And they're showing two different views of something. The org topologies view is more true and sort of constant in terms of applying to give a view of everything. And then this is more specific for a given team. It's saying this is your own personal map forward.
Yeah. So the regarding let me just finish first, and then I'll react to actually difference what I understood, what I saw in with the org topologies. Is just to react to I see the chats about feature team adoption map. I think the term is actually pretty good because it is a map. Map meaning like a map where you're going from one place to another, and so it's a route. You could say a route, not a map. Then. A route, and then it shows you that. But I think map is also just fine, and it's related to feature teams. So let me just continue a bit. So now imagine you have a next group. Next group is actually working on that. I mentioned already, and they have this dependency on another team. Now this is some situation which is now seen quite extensively, especially in recent companies, is that when you create now you need to create requirements areas, and there is a tendency in LeSS adoptions to create requirements areas with this after this grouping like this. So you have a group of teams which is then working on this part, and a group of teams working on this part, and then they say we are requirements areas. But that's actually not what requirements areas are. Requirements areas have nothing to do with the systems. Requirements areas are based on requirements. And so that's why you can't really consider like full-fledged feature teams if these teams can deliver the features, simply because in the backlog priority is going to say at some point, your stuff, we don't need to do much stuff in this group. We want your teams to work on other stuff, and then suddenly these teams going to say, "But we cannot," and then you notice they are not really feature teams. Okay, that's something to kind of keep in mind. And which brings me to the next picture. Imagine that you now in the same picture, essentially, you can actually create a visualization of the multiple groups of teams. So with the line here, there is a separate group. After the flip, they're actually in a different position. So they after the flip they can actually cover the whole thing, okay, and a whole system. In this case you can see that they cover the whole system, and therefore whatever reason they also have a bit more capability because it's easier in their case or whatever it is, okay. And then you say even further, you can say ATDD is adopted. Okay, so that's just to give you another example of a granularity level of a capability. And then you say now we have those groups, or the first group that I talked about. They actually can do much more because they adopted the skill of ATDD capability, and they can apply this. So they can do full-fledged, properly done end-to-end testing. And the components might not be yet completely tested. That is going to take years maybe, but the capability is there of the teams to do that. Okay. Now the next step is then you basically becoming a much more full-fledged feature team, meaning that there is no distinction between teams where they focus on. So regardless, these original teams that were formed, they can actually cover also the other components, okay, and vice versa. The original teams that were formed here, they can also cover these components. Okay, and one way how this is being done, by the way, is by also shifting the teams. So there is a easier cross-team learning. So teams from one area, they shift to another area, and then because they are doing together refinement and sprint plannings, etc., across teams, they learn from each other much easier. And in this way, they become even more cross-components. Okay, and that's then this situation where all onboarding teams can work on all components. And so then you achieve that. Now you are left with only claims system here. There's a separate story which I didn't include here, and that might be next step. Okay, we are becoming a really end-to-end product focused. Now, what's really the key thing and key objective of a feature team adoption map is if you do not do feature team adoption map, what happens is that LeSS adoption starts to die out. The management has to have this plan, essentially, has to have this projection, and have to make a decision, this is the direction that we are going towards. Because if they do not do this, it also means that they do not have a proper perfection vision, organizational perfection vision. And if they do have a perfection vision, they have to have a means to work towards that perfection vision. They have to have an actual layout idea of how that's going to actually look like. And that, now they know as organization, what is our job now to start to do improvement, and what kind of improvement is necessary. This is basically the purpose of feature team adoption map. So if you say we do less huge, but we don't do feature team adoption map, then not sure what exactly is going on. Yeah. They're going to be hitting some kind of a level which doesn't go beyond that, essentially.
Very nice.
Yeah.
If you use it as a way to measure your progress of the less huge adoption, you're assuming that everything stays the same, right? It's not like everything is always moving. Teams are leaving, or teams are maybe parts of the company. There's some pressure for expanding that part or whatever. There might be all kinds of new things going on that will influence, and you would have to redraw the feature team adoption map from time to time, I guess, because you cannot set it once and then continue finishing it for the coming years, can you?
Of course, but because we are not doing this on a team level, and this is one major difference with org topologies, we don't. This redrawing doesn't happen. It's just adjustments.
Oh, we don't do org topologies on the team level.
I read that.
Well,
exactly.
maybe
Yeah.
You can, but
well, as with the feature team adoption map, you can also use it, as somebody said today, to help one team see something. So you can, I mean, you can do anything you want with anything you want, but it's not how we use it with Roland. So this is misunderstanding.
Ah, okay, my bad. Yeah. So in any case, feature team adoption map is not per team thing, as I just explained why this is the case, because the feature teams don't need to cover as many components as possible. That's not the point. Yeah.
So we have 35 minutes before the time box. I wonder, would be nice maybe to hear what everybody takes as key messages from today, so we can kind of learn to paraphrase what we heard from Victor, and then maybe it gives us opportunity to actually learn more because it will be framed differently. Would it be a valid thing to do the remaining half an hour? Or Victor, you had something else to show and to teach us?
No, I actually left a half an hour for discussion and remarks and whatever.
Yeah, so I would be really happy to hear other people's understanding. So because some wording did not really fit my brain the way Victor has framed it, but it's not because Victor did wrong. It's just because probably I need more different wordings to understand something. So I would be really happy to hear what other people make of it. Thank you. That's my request for help.
So for me, Alexei, I think it resonates a lot what Victor said about my understanding. I think what I took away is again, it's a kind of a map of organizational improvement, and there I see a lot of kind of similarity and to org topologies, and I'm happy to hear what you say. And yes, I really love some new things like this kind of that adoption dies out if you don't have this kind of perfection vision and you look at where you want to go. and I think the key point here is like Victor said in the beginning, there's always a scale. And I sometimes I say in my course that basically if your feature is to move the button from left to right or to make it green, then that your typical component team, the interface team, is your feature team, because it will actually do kind of the requested feature by changing that one component. And so it's a very big scale, but the more complex features you have, the more broader you see the product. That's why, again, resonated a lot with me about that it has a lot. It's a lot related with product expansion. The broader the product is, the more difficult it's going to be a feature team. And again, it's not about that every feature team has to do every feature, but you want to be in the possibility to look at your requirements from the customer perspective and be able to implement them. And it's always about how good is your organization at the moment of taking those end-to-end customer requirements and being able to complete them without other support. And for me, it helps basically to trying to mapping this out. How good are we in kind of taking end-to-end customer requirement, as the customer will talk about them, and what is missing? And if I identify things that are missing, so I work a lot actually in the steps. So exactly as you said before I go to mapping up the flip and the part, I start looking and I ask people, even in my internal trainings, to pick up a few end-to-end customer requirements, write them down, and then look at where would you touch this all components, so that we look at 5, maybe even more requirements, see where we have interaction, see that we don't have to change all the components, and then what would be the first flip, and then I would create a group. And then I will see, later on, we might expand. So that was my kind of short summary.
I still have a question, actually, instead of a summary, which is maybe a very simple one. Would you make one feature team adoption map per requirement area? Is that the idea as you move on? Or would you make one for the whole company?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, sorry,
Victor. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure. I thought for one company, but then this picture that I'm now showing it shows actually for multiple groups. It becomes a very busy picture. So visualization is not great. So I would probably separate. Yeah. And so far I've done only separate. I didn't have a need to actually combine it. So they were just simply not needed.
It also depends on the product. So, for example, if you go to bank and then it's massive, you can say retail banking is one product and then it becomes very messy. But for example, you may go to a gambling company, it becomes easy, even though you still have many people working, but it becomes very simple because it's easy to draw that. So I think a lot depends on the context as well.
Yep. Greg?
I was thinking about a problem that came up to me in a class a week before last of people developing satellites, and so they develop a lot of hardware as well as software. And maybe a future discussion we could have in a similar format would be, hardware integration into a LeSS organization. Of course, we dealt with that at BMW also. But to Alexi's question, I found this really useful. Kind of a collegial exchange, and for Victor to have prepared it and facilitated it was really helpful to see how he's using a feature team adoption map more strategically on an organizational level than I usually do. So I don't think it's one or the other. The team level post-it note based facilitation tool I found really helpful, and what I've usually seen is stakeholders, managers, et cetera, come in and see what the team's aspirations are for what they'd like to learn and what they'd like to gain in skill. and the whole thing is a kind of a learning map. But to do it on the organizational level, which I think Bus may also do. I had never heard Bus explain it in detail. I'm not sure whether or not he does it in a similar way, but I see a lot of value in that, and I can take that away in the next time I'm doing coaching or training. So thanks.
Yeah, there is some differences in, and Bus is probably going to disagree with some stuff. He loves to disagree.
He always does.
Yep, exactly. So, and so I did talk to Bus briefly about it recently. I asked him some questions actually about this visualization itself. So it's also, for me, at some point becomes messy. So I kept challenging that, and then he explained the way he does it, and then which I can imagine and making it less challenging to avoid having a mess in a picture. But then I'm thinking like maybe better use a tool which is slightly less messy. So that's still kind of like a question for me. Yeah.
Thank you. And the fact that you emphasize that it's a journey, and to avoid this sort of, everybody has to do everything, so we can't possibly do it. It came out quite clearly in the discussion. You kind of de-risk the conceptualization during a training about what the benefits are, which I'm going to borrow. That's a bit more impactful than the way I've been doing it. Thanks.
Konstantin?
Yeah, thank you, Victor. Just before I go, Greg, some time ago, Ben collected a whole list of LeSS myths. And I'm using this list in my training to bust them LeSS myths.
Oh, cool.
So, and he created it was an exercise for the whole community. He posted it in the candidate LeSS trainer email list. I don't know if you remember, guys. And it was like a Google spreadsheet list with all kinds of LeSS myths. And I'm using.
Can you find it?
Sorry,
where can we find it?
Look in the Google group.
Look in
the Google group.
I'm currently looking in the Google group, and I'm not finding anything which is Ben and myths in there. And
then we need to ask Ben. There is a list.
Don't remember.
I can send you the ones that I resonated the most with, and which are in my CLT training as a slide. There is every chapter there is a slide about LeSS myths, and one is like every team can work on any feature, and every person can do all the work that a team requires. That everything is in the DoD, right? This is like the most misconceptions, right? So I have it on the slides, and then we're busting the myths in the training. No, it's not the case. And I can send you those few slides that I have. Not a problem. And another one. So to Victor, thank you so much. So what I took with me is it's really nice to see how you go through it, like step by step. I hope you share the slides.
I will. Yeah.
So draw the components which are owned by a team and department. So I just underlined it because I do that when I do the feature team adoption map, but it's I see the importance. Feature team adoption map is not a map of teams, but it reflects the organization. The slide with capabilities and readiness of components, I like that a lot. A different perspective again, probably a third or a fourth axis dimension. I mean, I like this a lot. So I can also see that the way you presented it is very useful, probably in internal trainings, less in public trainings.
Yeah.
Because in public trainings, you don't have this coherency of, this is the product, this is the architecture.
Yeah,
so,
it's too far-fetched. People get lost in this level. When I cover this in a public part, I just lose audience. People are kind of like,
yes, exactly. So in a public training, I actually use a org topologies picture.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Buzz spends, I think, 3 hours in his CLP making people create a feature team adoption map,
Yeah.
and it's the most confusing exercise I've ever experienced in my whole life. And I saw it twice already, and he's gonna keep it because it's Buzz, but it just doesn't work. I mean, because you really need a context of a specific product,
Yeah.
I believe, to make it make any sense if you're going into the details of that exercise. So for in-house classes, I think a perfect tool for explaining LS, it just creates more confusions, and we need less confusions, as we agreed before. So,
so like I said, that's why in public classes I start using the orthopologist picture and saying, well, look, guys, identify yourselves. Oh, we are here in this box. Okay, so you see LeSS is here, far up right. And how to do the steps. Here are the feature team adoption map. This is how you identify the access. Do it yourself. We're not doing it here. Let's move on.
Yeah. So regarding that, in a public class, the reason I mentioned I struggled with that in public class because I don't do many public classes. I almost entirely do only internal one. The last public class of mine, it was a long time ago. So regarding should you do this in a public class or not, I would check with Buzz, because he does it, and he all I can say, I know that he also had a confusion, but he actually improved the way of teaching. And so I would ask him and how he does it, and maybe he can explain.
It depends on the public class on the audience of the public class. If you have multiple people from the same company, then it creates for the people from that company, it creates a takeaway that they can take with them to the company and then start doing something. But for the rest of the people, it's an exercise to see how the others are doing it.
Okay.
So I was in a class with Buzz where he had many people from the same company, and it worked well. So the others could see. But if you have like just few people from different kind of companies, no, you cannot create this kind of a picture.
Yeah, I remember when I was in Buzz class long way back. We had like 5 people from different company, and nobody was willing to put a feature team adoption map. So I did it, and then we collaborated that, but they could not relate it to it because they did not have experience of that product. So I think it does become difficult.
Yep.
Can I go next, please?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just first of all, thank you for this session. Really useful. I think what I found really useful is that transparency aspect of it with management, because then a lot of time management may see it and then may not, or they may have a wish list. So I think with management, what I found is that they like the concept of every team should do everything, because of course it's obvious that it is less dependency and then they can work, but they don't see the x-axis. They still want to keep the way engineering is done now, and then we have a release department, blah blah blah, that way. And I think so that agreement and that transparency helps, and also helps to track where the teams are, because that's what they like anyway. But I think that's a good thing. I see that way as a good thing, because then you can take management to Gemba and ask them what help they can provide to move that team forward, right, from that way. So I think that transparency aspect is really good. I also probably for tracking, I found I learned about topologies when I was in the LeSS coaching camp. So it's a very complementary tool with that also to, I think, simplify it, take it this way, and possibly extend it further to say that who can help. They may have a group of people who need to upskill the team currently. With, say, for example, release is complex, not automated, and they do certain things, and they can collaborate with the team to understand, and then they. So I think those kind of things are very helpful when those are seen in a visual way, because our brain can't keep it, all those complexity. So I think that helps a lot. So thank you again. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the explanation. Thanks, Alexei, for setting this up. Of course. My opinion actually after this session is I think I'm getting it a little bit better. But the most important learning I have is, wow, if this is such an important tool to continuously monitor the continuation and progress of your less used adoption, I would suggest that we as less people, or you as less people, I don't know, work a little bit on making this thing more understandable and more, consistent, because there's some in there that doesn't make it a good tool, I think, to really measure progress. That was my takeaway.
Thank you. Pascal?
Yes, I really liked it, the discussion, and I've been, for example, what I like is the perfection goal. Like say the huge problem is, hey, this is the ultimate, which is gives something also for the manager to always strive to do something better. Also, the x-axis, both axes are maybe a little bit more clear, but also the limitation of the image, because the goal is, of course, was a bit more on getting the image right, and now move to, like say, we got 3 feature teams or 2 feature teams, and we see we get more demand that another feature need to be the team number 3 needs also be a feature team because of the demand. It's difficult to put it in a map. It doesn't matter because it's not where you measure it there, and so these kind of things I think should not put into map. Like, hey, we got now 75% of this feature map, and now we got 80%, and this kind of, because it's not the goal of and that's why for me, like, hey, we need to something different for that. So if the team say, hey, where do we see that progress? Well, not in this map, at least, because it makes no sense for me to put it in this map. And I also like the granularity, let's say the scale of, for example, the first statement you make in there are 3, there are some components, and there's one component team has got one fully featured team in your example, and then maybe that the other team can also review other stuff from the component team, and then with the scale you slightly move a bit more on getting it better. So this is also something you do not put in here, but I really liked it that way. Thanks for
you're welcome.
For sharing.
Carol?
Carol?
So thanks a lot for this session. Thanks to Victor for sharing with us. Definitely my understanding of the feature type adoption map is better. And thank you for also managing a discussion, because what helps me understand things is not only what presenter says, but different perspectives and maybe even struggles of others. My main takeaway is 2 things. One is like reminding or emphasizing that the x-axis is actually highly contextual, and I'm thinking maybe that is the reason why it is not clear to many of us, and why the official description is not that clear, maybe because it's quite generic. And I agree with Roland, maybe some work on creating some more practical, concrete example, which might not resonate with everyone, but would be more concrete, might help. It definitely helped me showing like actual example from industry I was actually working with, so it helped a lot. And seeing this, and that it's not to be designed like in one single afternoon and takes probably a lot of iterations. And the second takeaway is reminding that it is like very important as a tool to creating this perfection vision, and that it helps for the LeSS adoption to live longer and succeed. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Tim?
Guys, Victor, exceptional session. I really benefited a lot. It was, I went through it in LeSS as well, so I saw all of the confusion that I think we were in Singapore somewhere, but all of the confusion that took place in class. But this was really I mean, the preparing the slides and everything, you just made it a lot more clear. But to Roland's point, I think it's critical that it seems like, and it makes sense that it's a critical component of a less huge adoption. So I think it's something that really should be emphasized more. And all of the trainers, I guess I would tell you to kind of take that feedback back to back to the trainers group, because I think it's critical. and I wasn't sure if it was Steve or someone else that emphasized, because in Craig's class I don't ever even remember going through it at all. So that's my feedback. But thanks, awesome session.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I am enormously grateful for the learning I have received today. It's a familiar tool, and I feel like I'm looking at it a bit differently now. The thing it's done for me is grounded it as a contextual thing that is kind of engaged with and owned by the teams that are using it, and it's really telling their story and their own sort of navigation of where they're going to go and understanding where that's going, rather than being a more sort of teaching tool about teaching the concept. It's not really about that. It's more about like navigating specifically. And I really like how this session's run. I've just really enjoyed seeing many familiar faces and some that I'm not sure I've seen as faces before. So that's fantastic. And just having the discussion from many people, and also just Victor sharing his experience. It's just been so good. So my appreciation.
Good. Thank you. Alexi?
Yes, thanks a lot, Victor. So I really like one of the early slides you showed, where you have different components of the architecture and teams being able or not being able to work across those components. And your message was, well, not all the teams need to know everything, and it's a myth. It's a myth, apparently, from LeSS, and I also try to bust it in my classes. But then when you look at the feature team adoption map, this message is kind of lost, because you're looking at all the team's capabilities across all the components. So I think my takeaway is that feature team adoption map works together, works well if it's just one dimension with which you are describing the progress of LeSS adoption. But if you look at it just as a one and whole, only a single dimension, then you got this wrong. So it's one of these maps or mappings that need to be looked together with other snapshot or slices, and that slide where you could really see which team is working on what, I think is another dimension which is important to also show. So maybe that's where my initial confusions of feature team adoption maps are coming from, because it's described as a tool on the website, and it described as maybe the only progress tracking. I don't like this word, but we understand what I mean by this, I guess, for LeSS adoption. And I don't think it works well if it's just the only one. And if you would, if you would have access to the website and put more of your slides there to explain better feature team adoption map concept, I think that would provide a lot of value for the broader community.
Yeah. So as a preparation also for this talk, I wrote a draft of the article which explains fully everything essentially. And but I didn't want to publish. I wanted to kind of get your views and also see how to react and stuff, etc. So we're definitely going to do that, just to react to the last point, Alexi. And just a feature team adoption map, I guess the key reaction to what you all mentioned is that I agree fully about the visualization thing. It clearly needs improvement, and it's clearly obvious why it's confusing. It was confusing to me also for a very long time. And so then eventually I figured out, but then you beg the question, what's the trouble of me figuring out? It's still difficult to teach, etc. So there's something wrong with the visualization, clearly. So that's why I, in the beginning, mentioned feature team adoption map is not for me this visualization. It's basically everything what I just explained from the beginning. There's quite a many elements together. And so there might be also what's creating confusion. If some of those elements are not understood or understood differently, then creates a confusion later on. And so I think if we talk about it's confusing the visualization, I agree. If we talk about it's confusing as a practice with all the elements, then yeah, then we might need to kind of a deep dive in all the elements that we're talking about. And so, yeah, but I think that that's not an issue here anymore. It's more the visualization part, what we're talking about, and reacting to it. This is my kind of a takeaway. And, yeah.
To maybe understand it even more deeper, and maybe thinking of what we else can do in the next calls like this. Maybe have a specific case study, have a specific company, and maybe in a workshop in Miro, do this mapping, like guided by somebody who understands some company, so we better actually understand how to use it.
Can do. Yeah. Okay.
I use it quite similar to what you just described, Victor. So if anyone is interested, maybe at some other time, I could show you also how we used this at least 2 previous companies I was involved in. It was quite similar to what was said today.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe if we can have different people share different stories and pictures and cases next time, so we'll go deeper into this topic. Don't jump to another topic, but really stay with this one. That might provide more value for me personally. I will need to check with you guys, but I see some thumbs up on this one.
I like that idea of not being superficial, going deeply into a subject. And I something that has always occurred to me is that, after LeSS was published, the Scaling Lean and Agile, and the first 2 books and the website and so on, the kind of continuous learning of coaches who are applying things, adapting them, learning and having insights. There's not really an easy way to capture that learning and kind of clarify it. But these calls are a way to share experience, and maybe then if there's a publishing afterwards of one way or the other, we can make a more dynamic, engaging knowledge base for people to participate in.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. People are leaving, so I assume it's the time to leave. Victor, will you be able to share this portion of your slides with us?
Yes. I'll export in Keynote, I guess, format.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I'll see how can I get a recording to a cloud, so we can also have this one.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, guys. It was nice to see. That was the most successful online LeSS event I have participated in.
Less confusion.
Likewise.
That's like an open space session at a LeSS.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah, Victor, it was your idea. Thanks a lot. Amazing stuff.
Thank you.
Let's go deeper into this one.
Yes.
Let's have lunch in this part of the world.
I'm outside.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye. You have lunches in the Netherlands?
Sure do.
Bye-bye.